Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to a book talk for the month of March. That begins really a series of talks in which we're going to explore mass timber and the role of tall timber architecture, which is the subject of our new exhibition at the Skyscraper Museum. So we thought it was a perfect way to launch a series into the investigation of this new material, in fact, an emerging system of new materials of mass timber. We thought it a wonderful way to begin where the material starts, which is in the forest, and with a tremendous new book that's come out that helps explain and put all of this subject into context, designing the forest. And other mass timber futures. The subtitle connects the forest to the fabrication of the materials and the material culture of this really revolutionary building material that can help to save the planet, as Lindsey Wikstrom will help to explain, and explain in very clear terms, as this book is not too thick, very concise, and very respectful of trees, because the amount of information for the amount of paper that is in this book is a very high density reward. Lindsey is an architect who is the founding partner of her firm called Mattaforma. She's educated in architecture, especially at GSAPP at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where she also now teaches. She has worked with other firms, including Studio Gang, and also with David Benjamin, another colleague from GSAPP. So she's very much schooled in the study of materials, the pursuit of both a theoretical and a practical understanding of the material substance of design culture and the origins and context for those things. So in this book, Lindsey takes not just a deep dive into the forest, but also a manner of understanding and explaining the material through drawings, for example, on this page. And as you'll see in a moment, when she comes on the screen, some of the drawings that she will use in order to illustrate the book, but also are illustrated in our exhibition. Putting together the research, the deep thinking about the systemic nature of the materials and their connection to their origins of wood in the forest is it imbues her work throughout with both an analytical, but also, I think, a kind of deeply emotional connection to the materials. So I should allow her to illustrate those ideas herself. So I'm going to ask Lindsey to share her screen. Here is Lindsey Wikstrom.
Thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Carol, and to the Skyscraper Museum for hosting this amazing event, and also for including my work in the exhibition. It's a real honor to be surrounded by incredibly inspiring colleagues like Lever Architects, Gensler, Susan Jones, and many, many more folks. So it's a pleasure to join you in our enthusiasm tonight for mass timber and also just regenerative architecture in general. I'm giving a talk that links my work at Mattaforma, which is architectural work, and curatorial work and moderation work, to the work of the book. And so I'll show two projects that led up to a lot of the research in the book, and then we'll finish with highlights from the book and also a Q&A that we can dive into more topics that you're interested in. So my talk that combines these three projects, the book, a built work, and a curation project, is called Care as Choreography. It's an idea that I think about when I imagine the movement of materials as part of our scope of architects. So for example, I'd like everyone here in the Zoom room to pause for a second and look around the room that you're sitting in right now. And imagine that all of those materials around you are in motion. They won't be in this place forever. They are headed somewhere, and they're all headed probably in different directions and at different speeds. It's just a speed that we're not used to seeing or imagining. And that kind of choreography is what I think architects should really be focused on and thinking about. One of the biggest questions I have in my practice, no matter what kind of project I'm doing, is how is that going to change that way of thinking? How will that change design? So choreography of materials involves time, energy, and space. To me, these are the real materials of architecture, as they have been for a long time, but maybe we'll see them anew as we go forward. So one of the first built projects of my own practice, Mattaforma, is the music venue out in Gowanus in Brooklyn. We partnered with Public Records to produce a space called the Nursery. And the Nursery was open at the beginning of 2023 and had events every Sunday at this altar of a DJ, celebrating community and biodiversity and sustainability. This client was especially amazing to work with, particularly because of their obsession with sourcing. They really care about the ingredients that go into food, the ingredients that go into drinks, and all of the kind of components, the pH level of the water, the music sourcing. And so we were thrilled to extend that obsession, that ethic, into the material palette at play in the Nursery. The prompt that we received was to create an overwinter garden for their collection of plants. So we treated their plants like clients. We understood where they came from, what their ideal temperatures were, what they needed to survive and thrive, and how could we create those types of spaces using passive solar design. So here is a couple of examples of how we simulated the way that the sun was hitting the space that we were designing for a nursery and designing with the materials that could hold heat the longest over winter. We used 4 shipping already on site in what we called free walls. This is part of our ethos when it comes to using and consuming less material. And then the material that we did produce anew on site was all regenerative. So the timber was an LVL system, laminated veneer lumber. One of the many acronyms you might hear tonight, along with a lot of mass timber products. You have cross-laminated timber, CLT, dowel laminated timber, DLT, nail laminated timber, NLT, and then LVL, PSL, LSL, that kind of the list goes on. So we chose LVL in this case because all of the elements are exposed to differentiation in humidity levels, especially with tropical plants underneath them. And so LVL, what it is veneer strips that are cross-laminated at really thin layers using multiple species. And so each of those species reacts differently to water. And this kind of biodiverse mass timber product is one of the most resilient. It creates the straightest lines, and it also puts money into multiple species in the forest, a topic that we'll talk about in a little bit. We worked with a phenomenal landscape architecture group to specify a tree here that is not necessarily native to New York, but is native to cities, native to places that are difficult to survive in. And this is another topic of conversation in my practice. What does it mean to be native to a place? When trees are migrating and changing with the ever-changing climate, what does it mean to introduce a landscape to a place that is meant to survive or thrive for 100 years, 20 years, 1 year? Our answer in each case might be different. So the nursery took advantage of these products. The LVL product was made by Weyerhaeuser. It's a very off-the-shelf available product. And what was amazing about this way of sourcing for the client was that it's a story that a lot of people can copy. Rather than doing a kind of bespoke sourcing of wood, we looked at all of the products that were available off the shelf, and we chose to work with Weyerhaeuser because of their history creating regenerative practices and their remaining dedication to regional growth and manufacturing. So all of these off-the-shelf products came from Virginia. They were grown there and they were manufactured there, which is really rare to see on the shelves of big box stores today. So overall, this project, although small in scale, had so many stories packed into it, and the fact that it became a place for both people and plants to be together and be in changing weather together, it really embodies a lot of the ideas in our practice at Mattaforma and in the book at large. Another project that really ran in parallel to the book, the development of the book, was a project that maybe some of you have heard of. It's called Material Stories, or Material Worlds. I have another project called Material Stories. Material Worlds at the Ambasz Institute at MoMA. So the new director, Carson Chan, graciously commissioned me to gather many people. So around 50 people were eventually invited to speak on behalf of their material expertise. And we created a speaker series that went over 13 episodes and covered questions like, what's the future of concrete? How should we think about water? Who is in charge of silica? The physicality of the internet. And we spanned the globe with these conversations. I decided to make a map that showed the global voice at play. And what it really did was reveal to me that I, as a curator and moderator and organizer of the speaker series, do have a lot of bias. So one of the topics in the book and in my own practice is to really understand where history and stories are coming from, where are precedents coming from. And in this case, when I mapped out the Material Worlds episodes, there are large swaths of land that are underrepresented in the conversation about the future of materials. So hopefully one of you can pick up the mantle and continue the story today, and at least know that when you do watch Material Worlds, that these are the gaps. I think it's important for architects and just creative folks in general to look at a kind of gap analysis of their work every so often. So some of the amazing headlines that came out of that project, I'll just name one from my friend Maylene Loco. Home of the Future has coconut husk air filters, fruit leather shoes, and a dress made of roots. So thinking entirely about biogenic materials and healthy living as a way of life and a way of engaging the landscape in a whole new way. So the conclusion of this project, this 2-year-long project, was that we should really stop saying this question on the left. Is this material sustainable? Is this building sustainable? Rather, it should be much more explicit about who is being sustained. Who is being sustained by this design in particular? Because as we will see eventually in some of the research I bring up from the book, the last 500 years of extractive practices that have had a detrimental effect on, say, forests were a project of sustainability, in my opinion. They were meant to sustain a particular group of people. And so when we enter into this new era of repair, we should be asking ourselves much more explicitly and each other, who is being sustained by this design? My practice in this way of thinking, working with materials across the supply chain rather than just for the sake of opening day at a building scale, started back in 2017 with this project I mentioned, 3 material stories. These 3 drawings, which highlighted wood, steel, and concrete, were originally published in a book called Embodied Energy and Design, and then later made their way to the Milan Triennial called Broken Nature. We do see an advanced version that includes a mass timber story in the Skyscraper Museum exhibition today. The idea of this drawing is to use a new form of projection called equirectangular projection, or a 6-point perspective, a type of drawing that I adapted from a very kind of historical precedent, usually associated with world building or world mapping. I wanted to map the story of materials onto one piece of paper And the idea of that, getting everything onto one piece of paper, was to put all of these spaces that are typically not co-located into relationship to each other and into the scope of architects, so that we could have a say on whether our designs are improving these spaces or not. And most often they are not. So there's a lot of work to do across the supply chain of materials, so that places of consumption and places of production would actually be improved by design, rather than one being improved while the other is not. The reason this is so critical in my practice, and I think in a lot of folks' work, is the issue of embodied energy and carbon emissions. So right here we see a graph representing some data that's recently collected by a group, Architects 2030, a group that I'm part of their organization and a representative of. We see here that 23% of the global CO2 emissions is caused by only 3 materials: concrete, steel, and aluminum. And this represents the industrial heat it takes to manufacture and move these 3 materials. There's so much heat involved, and so much fossil fuels that are burned to get to that level of heat, get to those temperatures, that they account for more carbon emissions globally than all transportation combined. That's flying, driving, everything that you can do transportation-wise is lower than these 3 materials. You also see that building operations is higher. And what I am the reason I focus on embodied energy, which is the 23% here, is because building operations tends to trend with capital. In other words, when you save energy, you also save money. The opposite is true with embodied energy. You tend to emit more carbon when you save money. And so that right there, that switch to low embodied energy materials is a really, really big challenge, and will only become a greater and greater challenge as we go forward in the world. And one of the biggest reasons why it will be an ever increasing challenge is because the amount of construction that's predicted by the UN here, this data released in 2019, and this drawing is from the book, it's probably from the introduction chapter. The amount of construction is equivalent to all 5 boroughs of New York City being added to the planet every month, somewhere on the planet, every month for the foreseeable future. And if all of those buildings, every level of every tower that are being added to the planet are made of minerals, mineral-based materials, that's an equivalent hole being dug in the crust of the earth every month at the equivalent of all 5 boroughs of New York City. And so that's the amount of mining we would have to do, and the amount of industrial heat we would have to burn to get all those materials to become buildings. And so my question is, why not some of this construction be regenerative? Because trees regrow. That's the most amazing thing about mass timber. So mass timber, this is a long walk towards why I think mass timber is so critical for the planet's future, is because it can actively replace, for the first time in human history, these urban materials of concrete and steel with a biogenic material that is competitive structurally and performance-wise, so in fire, in life safety performances. It's competitive. It can be used in cities. Currently, the IBC, International Building Code, allows for 18 stories, and there are towers out there that are much higher that have already been built. So here's one of many reports, in this case by Bureau Happold, showing that every little bit counts. This is another ethos of Mattaforma, is that we are not an all or nothing office. Every single element that we can source well and source regeneratively makes a difference, and we celebrate all of those wins. Because if we were to only win or celebrate when we did an all wood building, it would take a really long time to get there. So this shows that every little bit makes a difference. This also shows that an all-wood building on the far right is not zero energy. There's always a transfer of energy. And this understanding of how much energy and what kind of energy is much more interesting to me than a kind of race to zero energy. I want the place that the wood is sourced from to be improved in the same way that the building is improving the landscape in which it's built. So when you Google mass timber, you might see a lot of images like this, and typically I'll ask the audience, what are folks' doubts about mass timber? And so feel free to take this moment and write in the chat, and we'll collect your questions. What are your doubts about mass timber? What are things that are on your mind? Too often, wood is greenwashed, in my opinion, and we kind of glaze over the details here. But what I'm interested in is building a really strong, sober movement, as well as with my colleagues here, that's dedicated to regenerative practice and what it means for the future. We are about, in New York at least, 2 years in to a mass timber material era. Concrete is 120 years old. So we have 100+ years to go. So this is just the beginning of this next phase of urban built environment. And it's really exciting to be part of it, part of the formation of what that means. Typically, folks say that the top concern they have, and we'll get back to other concerns, but I'll just share the top concern I had as well, is this question of whether there are enough forests in the world to support this kind of future. Or will we inevitably start to deforest and ruin our forest by thinking that we can build so much with mass timber? So these kinds of ideas, this question, this concern, these real concerns by a lot of people, these are the reasons why I wrote the book. I wanted to do a full body scan of mass timber, and it ended up taking me into areas of the history of timber that I never saw coming. The politics of wood today and in the future are very interesting and very difficult and challenging. In fact, a lot of the performance issues like water and termites and fire, things that might come up, like to come to mind and maybe are in the chat now, those are actually the easiest problems to solve. Some of these deeper questions are cultural, spiritual, aesthetic, and those will take a lot longer to change and transition from. So first big question, if we were to build all of the new construction in New York out of mass timber, would we have enough wood growing in the state to source all of it locally? So to answer that question, I wrote this. This is a kind of small section in the book, but this was actually a paper that was sponsored by the UN Environment back in 2022, which was presented in Berlin on the importance of biodiverse mass timber. That's the topic of the paper. And in this case, New York City adds 50 million square feet of built area every year. So we'll say that we'll give them that. We won't even limit them we won't limit ourselves on the new construction we can build. And we'll only look at the top 3 most prolific species that grow in New York. Notice they're all hardwoods. If you know anything about mass timber, softwood is a much more profitable, more prolific species, which is really interesting. I would encourage you to read that part of the book if you're interested in the difference of softwood and hardwoods. New York is blessed with mostly hardwoods. So let's look at these 3 species. The first thing we have to know is how much wood can we get every year without depleting the forest? How much volume can we harvest without ever harvesting an area too much that it can't regrow? And so we have to know what it means to regrow. And right there is a political fork in the road. When I started to understand how to establish maturity, so a number of years that it takes for a certain species to mature, there are a lot of options for that, for establishing the maturity. 2 of the main options that I thought were really interesting and diametrically opposed are economic maturity or regenerative maturity, and most often they don't align. Economic maturity means the size that will fit in the sawmill. Regenerative maturity says the year that the tree will drop its seeds naturally. And in the case of beech, for example, you might harvest it 100 years before it drops its seeds. And so here I've defaulted to the most conservative approach, which a lot of foresters do not take, to regenerative maturity. So we're going to rely on natural regeneration, which gives each of these trees a different lifespan. And each of them has a different geometry. Some are tall and narrow, some are wide and short, and that changes how much wood can be harvested per acre. And so here I've used some math, so I won't bore you with all the math, to understand how much built area of mass timber can we get per acre of species. And right away, you'll notice it's really different. And this is where I start to share with students, if I'm lecturing with students or other architects, that we really shouldn't be running towards an optimization here. We really shouldn't be looking at optimizing for carbon or optimizing for built area, because that would mean that we're losing track of all of these other species, putting all of our eggs in one basket and one species and having a kind of monoculture mindset. What we should really be doing is thinking about how to incentivize biodiversity. So in this case, hearkening back to the title of the lecture here, choreography, how much wood just from these three species comes online every year, and how much carbon is sequestered in that timber that will then pull into the city, it's very different across these three species. And even this really simple diagram is almost confusing to me, and I made it, and this idea that we're going to sync up the construction in the city to the forest is something that really has to be like a designed flow, a designed movement between the two landscapes. But overall, after doing, again, kind of some math of how many acres of each tree exist, how much occupiable square feet can come from each acre, we end up with more than enough wood with just these three species, let alone the other, 20 some very prolific species in New York State to support this construction. So in conclusion, it's not really a math problem. It's not an issue of whether we have enough. It's an issue of whether we have the will to make this kind of change, this big of a change. So what does it mean to kind of work with biodiversity and mass timber? It's not as easy as using a timber column in place of a concrete column, or using a timber beam in place of a timber beam. To me, it's a much more nuanced design education. We have to understand how trees want to grow. They're not going to grow in my cute little acre squares, right? They grow in relationship. There's a forest ecologist, perhaps you know of her, Suzanne Simard, who has recently discovered two incredible things that change everything that we think about when we think about forest ecology today. Number one, different species work together to survive. Birch trees pass carbon through the mycelial network underground to feed Douglas fir, and vice versa. Number two, old trees somehow, we don't know how yet, store knowledge, and particularly the knowledge of how to resist drought, wildfire, and pestilence, those things that are worse during climate catastrophe. And when there are no old trees to teach younger trees how to resist those things, then we see a lot of death in the forest. So if we're planting large swaths of young trees of monoculture, where those forests aren't going to be around for long. The good news is an ability to design forests in a way that supports societies that they are related to is in our deepest history. We have been doing this much longer than mining, amazingly. Here's an example of 6,000 years ago where the pollen records show a society near the Amazon co-located with a completely cultivated human cultivation of trees that sustain each other. The forest was within the society, the size of the society and the size of the forest were designed at the same time. The trees in the forest, the actual species that were used, were designed to support the society. What kind of food do you want to use? What kind of trees are good for building materials? What kind of trees are good for fuel? All of those decisions were intentional and designed at the same time. This idea of designing forests to sustain society isn't only a non-colonizing idea, it's also a colonizing idea. And so we see this emergence of forests that were used to colonize areas. And so a lot of native forests were eradicated for the sake of planting species that were supporting a community elsewhere, not co-located with the society, but still a form of sustaining, right? So this idea of designing a forest to sustain a society isn't necessarily a good one. It's just an idea. The kind of forest that is used to design a particular kind of society, to me, is where we start to think about ethics in the design space. And a lot of these colonized forests or colonial forests we inherit today pretty explicitly as industrial forests. So industrial paper, industrial, palm oil are in the same soil, in the same plots of land that have been extracted from for hundreds of years. And so a big question I have is, what is the society that's sustained by industrial forests today, and how do we start to redesign that as well? So this idea, this qualitative assessment of forests around the world and who is connected to them and in what way and for what purpose harkens back to that question I asked: who is being sustained? And how can we measure these forests as we plant them? I'm sure you've heard of a number of initiatives around the world: the Billion Tree Challenge, the Trillion Tree Challenge, the Bond Challenge here. These incentivize tree planting as a form of climate mitigation. However, there's still a lack of ability to measure the quality of the forest planted. And in most cases, it's about counting trees. And what this does, when it's a one-dimensional metric of just numbers, typically old forests that have large trees, where folks have a difficult time measuring the quality of that, older tree holding knowledge, but are rather paid to or had pledged to plant numbers of trees, will take down the old tree and plant 100 trees in its place. And this idea of qualitative measurement in the forest is just beginning. This is right now the kind of cusp of forest ecology today. And I hope that the design of the built environment tracks and follows and encourages this development. We have very few tools for understanding biodiversity in the forest and for measuring it and incentivizing it across the supply chain. You've probably heard of these different initiatives that define ethics in the way that we source wood. These are great. These are a great start. But one of the things that I really think the book does well, and one of the things that's important in my own practice, is, like I mentioned at the beginning with the material worlds map. Where do these come from? Who wrote these codes of ethics? For example, SFI comes from our dear Weyerhaeuser. So Weyerhaeuser is an old timber company in North America that thrived, when a lot of land was stolen. Of course, most institutions take advantage of that history, but in this case, SFI, Ethical Sourcing Initiative, that text was born inside this company. And that means that it has a lot to do with productization of the forest in a really particularly low biodiversity way. And so it's not necessarily incentivizing biodiversity, more so incentivizing regeneration. So the kind of ethical sourcing that we do when we think about designing with wood is really critical. And I think there could be like 30 more of these ethical standards that potentially in one case of, Lever Architects, they're working on a new code that puts BIPOC forest owners into a list that you can buy from. And so it puts money into the pockets of particular folks. So that's a way to source ethically. And there are so many other ways that people are thinking about right now. Because when you kind of unroll the census of the people that are involved in timber today and mass timber today is quite monolithic. The interpretation of value at every stage of material processing and change is monolithic. So I'm really encouraged by students who want to be involved and other folks that feel like their interpretation of value in the forest isn't represented here, are becoming more interested in all of these phases of work. Because I like to imagine, what does it mean to think differently about wood product manufacturing? What does it mean to think more ethically about logging or building material suppliers? So I'm just super excited about how these demographics will start to shift. So I'll start to wrap up with a few examples that are inspiring to me, that start to bring us home to our roots of design and activate hopefully some of your curiosities and excitements about your own work today. So a couple other anecdotes before I get into 3 great forests. One is the issue of roads and mobility. So we built, the highway system, the international, or the interstate highway system here in purple, and then in green in the map, that's all of the above ground biomass of Appalachia. And so what I learned when I was working with a forester during my time writing the book, I talked a lot with a forester at the Black Rock Forest in upstate New York. And I learned about tree and forest migration. And this is one of the hot topics of forest ecology as well, whether or not to help trees migrate. The topic in brief, I won't try to summarize the entire topic, it's really complicated. You have softwoods, which evolutionarily speaking migrate with wind and water. So their seeds rely on wind and water to move around to become pollinated. Deciduous trees are a little bit younger, evolutionarily speaking. They're a little bit of a newer technology. They have figured out how to convince animals to move their seeds for them using flowers and fruit and nuts. And so the forests, both kinds of forests, both hardwoods and softwoods, are mobile, but in different ways and at different speeds and in a different relationship to the changing climate. And so this great NPR episode talks about how forests are racing north. So as the planet warms, a lot of these forests are trying to stay in a temperature that is comfortable for them. And those that can't move fast enough, those are the ones that will, and so through the species where they don't cross it. And so imagine a 4-lane highway, for example, might be impossible to cross. We should also know that our country is not exempt from forced labor conditions in the wood industry and across the entire supply chain. This has been going on, for a really long time, and it relies on different levels of forced labor and different types of visas that are very vulnerable and precarious. And one of the things that I think we could do a lot better job at is understanding in these jobs and who is being sustained by sourcing wood. I think that it's important that we understand all the people that it takes to build a building. It's not just one architect, it's thousands of people that are involved. And those lives really change when certain policies change. For example, a lot of worker visas were paused a number of years ago. The forest replanting initiatives in this country rely almost entirely on worker visas. And so when those worker visas were paused, the forest had a really, really dramatic effect. A lot of trees weren't planted. So this is why, just kind of giving you a hint about how political materials can be. I'll leave you with this. So when we do think about the impact of the built environment, we should definitely build less. But when we do build, we should source mass timber from a place, or just timber, regenerative materials with a cultural and environmental resilience in mind. And when I think about the people who are doing this already, people who are doing this really well, are these three folks. So the Menominee tribe, this group is based in, their nation is surrounded by the state of Wisconsin. Last year they were featured in the New York Times, where they got to tell their story. And I'm just so inspired by this story because it connects active participation in the forest with economic prosperity and biodiversity thriving. So in this case, they established the first sawmill, indigenous sawmill, and their territory in this aerial photograph is on the left, and then private family property of Wisconsin is on the right. The book has all of these ownership maps, which you see in the middle, that show how different owners of forests interpret value. And here in the photo, you can see there's a really particular forest management scheme happening on the Menominee land, and there is not that same kind of thoughtfulness happening on just the property next door. And that difference has such a major difference over generation. Now, after they harvested in a really particular way and utilized the land in a particular way, it's the most biodiverse spot in the entire region. Another great example is the Tapash Forest Collective. This group is working across federal, private, and tribal lands in order to establish new forest management protocols that break down the damaging history of checkerboarding on the West Coast. Checkerboarding, there's like a whole nother book to be written about that project. And this is amazing work that they're doing, and it's specifically introducing cool burning, so small fires that were for generations used by indigenous folks in North America, but were halted when settlers arrived. And without cool burning, this is why we're seeing mega fires. So this is a small fires in order to prevent big fire tactic. And then, well, strategy. And then finally, what I think is the most resilient, the most important, the most futuristic forest you could possibly source from, work with, partner with, is a forest that can sue you. If the forest can sue you, you can be sure that its ideas, its interpretation of value are going to be resilient. And so in this case, this forest has legal personhood. This idea of legal personhood is not new. It was originally written about by Christopher Stone. Well, a Western writer wrote about it first in 1972, but this idea is very old in different places. And the book was called Should Trees Have Standing in the 70s. And what it put forward was whether natural resources, already a kind of extractive term, but natural resources, mountains, rivers, forests, should have the same kind of standing in the courts as corporations do. Corporations are legal persons today in this country. Why not natural features, natural resources? And so in this case, I had to track down all the faces here of the folks that are charged with listening to this forest and representing its needs going forward. These are the people that have that job. It's an amazing new type of job, and it's something that inspires me every day to think about how we might work with wood in a really interesting, futuristic way. So thank you so much for listening. I think I'll join Carol here in a Q&A.
Well, thank you for that. I must say I was surprised because I've listened to at least 2 other of the YouTube lectures that that people should also enjoy, which were entirely different in their focus. And since one person in the chat has asked us, well, how is this mass timber used anyway? I have to say to you all, come back next week, because on Tuesday, the 12th of March, we have 2 structural engineers, Michelle Roloffs and Tanya Luthi, who will be walking us through the basics, Mass Timber 101. And we thought it was important to start with the forest, and indeed, because we really are celebrating this book, and I want to make the point that the book has two titles, or the main title, Designing the Forest, but the subtitle is And Other Mass Timber Futures. And although Lindsey didn't talk about it tonight, at least the last third of the book is devoted to the fabrication of the materials and all aspects of the process of production.
Yeah.
So we're going to answer all of your questions in a full semester of multiple parts, but to be able to dive deeply into the forest today was a wonderful start. And, you know, thank you so much for putting it into a context. So you described your research with foresters and a little bit of the breadth of your interviews and research, but could you talk a little bit more about how you entered the subject, and then how you kind of spread out in order to try to grasp the systemic nature of the issues, and then the synthesis that you use in the introduction, in a phrase that I find very appealing for people who are part of design culture, and that is that designing the forest is the first opportunity to co-produce nature and society. And so you haven't given that much of an explanation tonight about how you see this kind of a new kind of balance. You talk about the balance of the forest and the species, but talk a little bit more about the material side as it enters the world of the built environment.
Okay, yeah, thank you. These are great questions. So the way that I became interested in mass timber, the story that I use actually in the introductory chapter, I was working with David Benjamin. We were hired to do the design for Airbus's new engine factory in Hamburg, Germany. And that project was considered a lighthouse project by Airbus. They wanted it to be the future of aviation, the future of the campus there. And so they wanted it to be regenerative. It was also an engine that was really using a lot less fossil fuel. I mean, they were really thinking about sustainability in a generic sense. So in a way, just using less carbon. So the building had to match that. So when I started the project, I thought, what a great opportunity to learn about mass timber, because we hear in the mass timber space, you hear all the time that Germany started it and that Europe is way ahead. And so when we launched into the project, we worked with some amazing engineers in Hamburg, Herman Blumen, and we worked with a product called Balbuca, which was beech-based LVL mass timber. It's stronger, it's locally sourced in Germany, you know, all of the things that you always look for in a typical sustainable project. Locally sourced, traveling less distance. But then I kept wondering, how do we know that the replanted tree is going to survive? So we can say, you know, oh, it's regenerative because trees grow back. And okay, we can also say that this company that produces this product does replant trees. But like we saw on the graph, beech trees take 100 to 200 years to grow back. How do we know that 200 years from now, that tree will make it? And how do we have the audacity to say this is regenerative when we can't guarantee that it will be there? And so that started this question of, well, how have people dealt with that in the past? And it's actually a 1,000-year history of trying to police forests and build states based on the dependency of wood pre-coal. So before coal, wood was like oil, right? And it caused a lot of wars, just like oil does. And that kind of policing and dependency and multi-generational guarantee was really part of the way that wood became underpinned society and built environment. So who has control of that? How are those decisions made? big, long history, which made me excited for the future. So now, going forward, as we start to embark on this new idea about urban regenerative materials, so the fact that mass timber can be used in a tower or just denser living, like never before, the questions come up again, just like they have in the past. Who will be in charge of that? Who gets to say what's the right way? Who's going to guarantee that those trees are grown back? And that to me is the most interesting question, because it's not so easily answered. It's like a lifelong pursuit. And then
Can I mention
please.
one thing that I learned in my research of just listening to everybody who was an expert talking about the forest and about mass timber and the producers. And what I learned about Austria, apropos to what you're saying, is that there, where Austria has, I think, is its largest national product, timber, has a tradition that's at least 500 years old of regenerating the forest. So we know it can be done for 500 years or so successfully, because that's how long Austrian church lands have been managed as a source of harvesting a continuous renewable source of timber.
Yes. Yes, and regeneration is great, as opposed to cut and run. Like when the Homestead Act happened in North America, there was a lot of movement west, and a lot of that movement was loggers taking trees down, building houses, and moving on. And so there was this more recent history of not regenerating the forest. But even in the case of regeneration, like Austria, I think Stora Enso is a company that was founded in the 1400s. I mean, these timber companies are old. The way that they regenerate is of a particular ethic. It's not the same way that the Lenape would have, for example, on the island of Manhattan. And I think that difference of interpretation is what is interesting to me, especially when, groups that have controlled regeneration for hundreds of years are a particular monolithic group. So now what do we have going, what's possible in the future when we have a much more diverse way to regenerate? For example, and this is kind of to answer the first question of how we move into the built environment. When I talk about biodiverse mass timber, maybe I can back up and just say a couple of things about the current species that are used today in products. You'll hear in the cross-laminated timber world, which is the acronym CLT, that product is typically made of SPF, or spruce, pine, and fir, all softwood species. And softwoods are great because their geometry is really prolific. Super, super tall, super, super straight, super, super narrow. So you can grow a lot on a little piece of land, and you can grow them fast. And so that's why you see them more often. The thing with only sticking with those three species, or those three types of trees, is that we'll soon have to replace like the red maple forest, the beech forests, with spruce, pine, or fir forests in order to keep that product going. So I'm inspired by this kind of wonky product. Maybe you guys know it. I'm sure you do. OSB, oriented strand board. It's a kind of sheathing material that you typically don't see exposed. But before that product was invented, aspen trees and birch trees were thought of as the weed of the forest. They were so annoying to foresters. They were damaging. It was impossible to get rid of. Their weeds. Somebody invented OSB that took advantage of the properties of birch trees and the properties needed in the built environment. So properties in birch trees, properties needed in a house, created OSB, and now aspen trees are one of the most cultivated species on the planet. So there's this real connection between species proliferation and thriving, human cultivation, and the built environment and the products we use to build it, and economies, like economies of scale. So I guess I'll conclude with this really kind of counterintuitive notion that a forest that is connected to a market economy, that has a market, is a more resilient forest. A forest that is poor, that doesn't have a place in the market, will eventually either be replaced, cut down for urban development, cut down for agriculture, or burn. A poor forest can't protect itself. So this connection between market and species is really vital. And there's this moment of invention that really unlocks and supports biodiversity that's coming. And then also biodiversity credits. That's kind of currently being seen as even more critical than carbon credits today. How do you incentivize the use of biodiverse regenerative materials and then give subsidies for that?
Could you distinguish, or do you distinguish between managing the forest and designing the forest and optimizing the products of the forest?
It's a tough one. I think that's what a lot of producers struggle with. The short-term gains and the long-term investment. That's why I'm fascinated with, in the book, there are these ownership maps, like I mentioned. Each group has a different length of time that they're designing for. For example, let's say timber investment management organizations, which are real estate investment trusts that manage forests for private family wealth investment. So like pension funds.
You have a lot of drawings in the book that show color coding.
Exactly.
All especially of private.
Exactly.
And the varieties.
Right. So that group is actually really good at managing biodiversity because they know that biodiversity will survive or thrive the longest. And so there'll be the most money in the forest when you manage it with biodiversity in mind. However, then you have lumber, just to be very generic. It's impossible to summarize so quickly, and I don't want to throw any producer under the bus, but let's say a lumber or lumber producer who really sells just pine. They make money selling pine. So in the short term, they're going to make a lot of money if they only plant pine. But in the long term, their crop will dwindle because it's not supported by biodiversity. And so they had this real tension of how much to lose now to enable the future. And that's where a lot of groups' beliefs on climate change, its realities, its pitfalls are different. So some folks, some really large global organizations don't believe that forests migrate. And that changes the way that they manage forests and then the species that they put in them. And then other people are thinking about change in a much more rapid way, but they're less profitable. So there's a real tension there. It's definitely easy. So I think if you can use a lot of, if I were to say one big takeaway, for all of us here, the more difference you can have in a project, the better. So you have a variety of approaches will always be more resilient than just one approach. We don't want to just do only CLT in the building or only OSB. You're really minimizing its impact. But if you have a wide variety of approaches, then you're kind of spreading out the gains and incentivizing a pluralistic approach too. So that the CLT, you can have SPF, the OSB, you have aspen, and money is going into both of those species, for example.
Well, you've given us a very artful presentation of ideas which are incredibly complex, and I think you explain them very clearly, both in your talk and certainly in the book. Make the overarching argument, though, about why forests are important to us all and to the planet.
Well, to me, it's really simple. We need places to live. We need to build buildings still. Like I said, the UN is saying we need this construction. It's either going to come from a regenerative place or a mine. It's really simple. It's that simple. We're either going to be able to regrow the material, or we're going to continue to damage the environment with mines that are nearly impossible to heal. And so to me, that's the simplicity. Always just go with regenerative materials as much as you possibly can. And once you make that decision, the more thoughtfulness you can source things with, the better it gets, of course. There's a lot of work there to be done, but that fork in the road to me is very clear, very clear. Only then, like if we choose regenerative materials, let's just start working on that problem and just build this new 100-year, plus world that's not relying on fossil fuels or mineral-based materials. It's not going to be easy, and it's not there yet. It's not built yet. We have to go build it. But I think just deciding to go build it, I think that's where we're at. So that's what I'll choose. I choose that.
Well, the climate and carbon emissions is certainly the context through which I think within the last, I think in the engineering community, consensus about embodied energy being the real subject about our concern, and then broadly in the building community is really gravitated towards that being the entire argument, and then everything else falls within that agenda of dealing with those issues as the portions of what material or what energy source we use in order to build places that are as complex as cities and societies that need transportation, and they need buildings. So introducing the subject of timber not as a replacement for everything else, but the beginning of a solution of a continuously evolving built environment seems to me really important. One doesn't have to be, a super radical enviro, as the political tensions tend to work towards name calling and opposition and battles over forests, which were seen from the 1980s on, but really thinking about how people move together in order to, as you say, kind of co-produce with intention, with design, nature and society, so that they can benefit each other and keep on going. We hope we all keep on going. So,
well said.
Thank you for sort of starting us off in within the forest, but coming out in a constructive way, so that we can think about building a better future.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So, bye everybody. See you next time. Thanks for joining us tonight.